첫 번째 강연인 Pna의 투자와 개발 기회를 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 발표자인 모리스 브라운 존은 현재 Pna 오피스의 커머셜 매니저이며 파푸아뉴기니 국적의 소지자입니다. 민간과 공공 분야 모두에서 경력을 가지고 계십니다. 발표 시작하겠습니다.
Good afternoon. I'm Maurice Brown-John. I'm the commercial manager for the Pna office based in Majuro, Marshall Islands, a position I've held since 2010. For the previous 30 years, I was involved in fisheries in Papua New Guinea, both government initially and later the leading longline operator. I was also the founder of the PNG Fishing Industry Association and a director of the Fisheries Department since 1995. So I have a fairly broad background in the fishing industry, and many of you I would have met over the years. Today I'm going to talk about the Pna, 8 small island nations, or are sometimes referred to as 8 large ocean states. I will give a fisheries overview and talk to some of the investment opportunities. The contents, basically, I will split up into 8 sections. Who is Pna? The status of the fishery and the stocks, the impact of COVID on the region, work we're doing on fish aggregating devices, management and tracking, FIMS and industry FIMS, Pna Msc certification and Pacifical, economic opportunities in government and private sector, domestic investment, and food security, bycatch utilization and import replacement, and also the issues of community-based micro-canning. So who is the Pna? For many, the chart shows blue water, but in fact there are islands and small communities. The smallest economies are the 8 large ocean states. It's an area equivalent to New York to Moscow and maybe Greenland to Morocco. 14.3 million square kilometers, and the territory of Tokelau works with us. And you can see the populations on the left are very small, the smallest being Tokelau at 1,500, and PNG at about 8.5 million is bigger than, or many times bigger than the rest put together. The Nauru Agreement came about in 1982. Leaders met in Nauru, and due to common concern over a large foreign fleet, or several foreign fleets invading their waters, they had a common aspirations in the fisheries sector and common interests about their future. The resultant Nauru Agreement can be summarized as 3 key points. The need over the exploitation of common stocks of fish, both within the EEZs and adjacent waters by distant water fishing nations. The dependence and as developing island states on rational development and utilization of the living resources within the EEZ, in particular, the common stock of fish, which is tuna. And the cooperation to manage the EEZs to achieve maximum benefits from the fisheries resources. They saw then the reality that individually they could not take on the large industrialized nations, but were keen to defend the EEZs, which had only recently been declared. So I term our job in the Pna office, remembering there was no office for the first 28 years, as being like a cake, and I call it a fish cake. So the office was established January the 1st, 2010, on the direction of the leaders. That's the presidents in the first presidential summit on tuna. And there was 3 general areas. Can we grow the cake? Can we grow the fishery bigger? Can we take more tons and higher value? Today, the fishery is up from 2 to 3 billion to 6 to 8 billion retail value. Can the island nations take a bigger slice? Well, the access fees have jumped from about 60 to about 520 million under the VDS revenue. And can we add icing to the cake? So that is an area of vertical integration, processing, branding. And MSC and Pacifical co-branding has put Pna on the map for the last 10 years. It's increased investment, and it's allowed the region to start to take a small margin from the vertical supply chain. The history of the Pna measures in the region are quite interesting. These have been implemented through what we call implementing arrangements and minimum terms and conditions, MTCs. These are invariably world leading. So for example, in the 80s, we established MTCs, ships registries, good standing of vessels, mandatory catch log sheets, report of zone entries and exits, and 100% transshipment import. In 90s, we introduced 100% observer coverage in the purse seine fishery and port-to-port satellite tracking. In 2000s, we closed the high seas pockets as a term of domestic license. We introduced periodic FAD bans to help maintain big ice stocks. We introduced tuna retention, so to avoid high grading. 2010, we opened the office. We established the first MSc certification for a free school fishery, prohibition on whale sharks, mesh regulations, sampling, and the development of FIMS and industry FIMS. In the 20s, we have worked and continue to work on e-logs, e-forms, bunkering restrictions, tanker tracking, FAD management, longline VDS, and we're currently working on updating FAD registry and electronic monitoring, artificial intelligence, and marine learning of video observers. So for us, our people, sustainability is not an option. For the Pacific Islands, it's purely a matter of survival. And I think that must underpin the status that we give the fishery. The status of the fishery, this on the left is sometimes called the Green Tower. It also has other names, but it shows you the relative status of the regional RFMOs around the world. The big tall column is the WCPFC, where all 4 tropical stocks are in the green. You see in the other regions that typically 2 out of 4 stocks are in problems. And that is a reflection on management. It's not policies, it's management. You can have anything on paper. The other regions are also very heavily FAD dependent. And you see in our region, we have a very low FAD dependence, typically less than half the fishery sets are FADs. The stocks are healthy, as shown previously, and this is called the Majuro plot. You can see they are well into the green. And if you look at the effort on the right hand, this is the vessel days and how many days are actually used. 45,000 is the limit. And this year we are on target for the same level as 2017, meaning that we won't use all the days, but we're well on track for quite a good year. You see the effort trends, the number of vessels in the fishery has dropped a little bit. We're currently about 254. You can see the number of sets and the effort have dropped slightly over the years. And this gives you an indication of the fishery. If you look here, you can see the catch, and 2019 was one of the highest on record. 2020 preliminary figures are a fractionally drop. And if you look at the value of the catch, which is the blue bars versus the BDS revenue, you can see that the year-to-year catches have varied on value, subject to world price and supply and demand, but the revenue to the Pna nations has progressively increased. So if you look on this table, you see that the contribution to government revenues is up to 84% in the case of Tokelau, but typically between 40 and 70%, the main exception being Papua New Guinea, where it has significant, and Solomons, where they have significant other resources such as forestry and minerals. There are a few other revenue opportunities for most Pacific Islands. This is a similar presentation showing the catch value, the process value for those with processing, exports, and employment. The key is that fisheries is very significant. The third section, I will talk on the impact of COVID in the region. As of the 3rd of August, we broke 2 million, I think it's 2 million, sorry, excuse me, cases, 2.5 million deaths, and 200 million cases. But the Pacific Islands are among the last nations without the COVID pandemic by virtue of their isolation. The problem we have is that most of the region is less than 1% vaccinated, the exceptions being particularly the Micronesians, Palau, FSM, and RMI. This has left most of the people unvaccinated. And the vaccinations are not the panacea, because even if you are vaccinated, you can still catch and transmit COVID-19, but at a much reduced risk. It is critical to maintain strict COVID-19 protocols throughout the region, including the 14-day from the last contact. But you see here that French Polynesia, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Guam, Marianas, and also Hawaii, although it's not on there, are seriously infected, as are Indonesia on the land border with Papua New Guinea. The impact of this on the GDP projections in 2020 have been quite interesting. We have maintained the per seine fishery value, the VDS value, but we have lost the import commerce and spin-off benefits. About 5.4 million has been lost in the Pna의 observer programs, and our fresh long-line fishery and artisanal export fisheries, as well as those fisheries orientated towards feeding tourists, have been very seriously impacted. You see, for example, Fiji, although it's outside of the Pna의, has seen a drop of revenue projections, GDP, from +3 to -19 on the back of the collapse of tourism. For the rest of our region, where fishing has been the main source, the per seine fisheries, for example, Kiribati, Tuvalu, the impact has been less, but there has still been some impact. The biggest risk we face today is if COVID gets into the fishery, into the fuel supply, and therefore devastating the island economies. Unless the tankers are able to deliver fuel, it leaves the islands with no fuel. So if we look at the impact in other regions around the world, you see up to 50% of the seiners are anchored in the Spanish seiners in the Indian Ocean. General Santos temporarily shut down. Currently, we are seeing Thai processors suggesting a 3-week shutdown due to high infections in staff and foreign workers. And the main processing states throughout Asia are amongst the top 12 for daily infections in the Asian region. So whilst Pna의 maintains healthy fishing, we may see some reduced demand, and reduced demand may see reduced effort, and reduced effort may see reduced sales and potentially an emergence of an economic disaster in our region. So the case for vaccinating seafarers with no international flights for crew changes and provisions, all is being delivered by sea. This has kept the fishery operational to date, but with massive potential risk of COVID spreading into our region. And this risk, we believe, is growing with the new Delta variants. If the virus gets into our tankers, it will disrupt island fuel supply and distribution and power generation. If the virus gets into our fishery, it will cut global tuna supply and food supply, but most of all, our island economies and health services will collapse as a result. A practical solution is to require immediate vaccination of all seafarers in our ports. RMI has vaccinated, and when I wrote this 500, although today I believe the figure is 757 crew of various nationalities on fishing boats, but the region does not have sufficient vaccines to vaccinate all seafarers, not just their own citizens. So we need your help in rolling out vaccinations for seafarers. So the next section I'll talk on is fish aggregating devices. Okay, so now I will talk on fish aggregating devices and FAD management. You can see in the picture in the center, biodegradable FADs being developed for trials in Ponape and FSM and a sample of satellite buoys. So what is a FAD? Traditionally, a FAD would have been anything naturally occurring, whether it's logs, coconuts, animal carcasses, whale carcasses, in fact, anything that tuna could aggregate around. But today, FADs are man-made rafts anchored or near shore or drifting in the ocean. Traditionally anchored FADs, such as the Filipinos and Solomon's type ones, use lights to assess the aggregation, and then they are set on pre-dawn. But in the late 1990s, man-made fads emerged, and they were attracted initially by VHF buoys, which gave a 60-mile range. The fad numbers were limited, and again, it was hit or miss whether there was any fish under them. About 2012, we saw a shift from VHF buoys to standard satellite buoys, and this meant that 40 to 100 were typically manageable and could be tracked globally, but still no indication of what was under each fad. Last decade, we've seen the emergence of sonar capability, where you can see remotely what is under each fad. You can get an indication of the biomass, the species, the fish size, and that allows targeted, what I would term cherry picking, where a company can direct boats to specific fads with large aggregations. In total, we think there is between 40 and 60,000 fads tracking annually through P&A waters. We don't actually know, but we do know that every fad buoy has a unique ID, and we don't know very much about how fads work or the impact of so many fads in the waters, but this is an area where P&A and SPC are leading the study. In simple terms, the buoys report to the satellite reports through to the land, to the service provider, that reports both to the vessel and a copy to FIMS, and then it goes through. And here is an example of the 6 months tracks for 3 vessels. So in other words, this is 160th of the actual picture based on 30,000 fads. And we think these days it's probably nearer 60. So you can see they go everywhere. If we look at their densities and also how close together they are, you can see that in the left and the right pictures. If we look at the fate of those lost, the left gives an indication of the numbers coming up on the reefs in those areas. You see a high prevalence around Papua New Guinea and Solomons. And the right-hand side gives an overall assessment of what we think happens to them. About 7% will end up on reefs, which obviously is controversial because it's a vulnerable marine habitat. 10% will be retrieved and reused, and about 80% have unknown fates. Now I'll come on to FIMS, the Fisheries Information Management System, which is developed by the region and is owned by P&A these days. And it also includes the iFIMS, Industry FIMS, which is an unrivaled platform used by industry independent of the P&A system. So it has many aspects of what it can do. Vessel registry, VDS, crew registry, audit purposes, monitoring, control and surveillance, live video, alerts, e-forms, licensing, other integration, port sampling, reporting, catch traceability, observer management, observer tracking, and fad tracking. The bigger picture of what it can do is quite comprehensive. And for example, it can serve a lot of purposes for e-documentation, catch documentation, and exports, for example, e-certification. It has many aspects, and you can look these up on the website. And it can cover seed charts, bathymetric plankton, asset tracking. It can give us proximity alerts when 2 vessels come together, when fads and vessels come together, when a fad enters a zone, or if there is a non-fishing day claimed. And we have various dashboards where we can see representation of what's happening in the fishery. We can also take real-time positions of vessels, and this was a month ago, and you can see the vessels range everywhere from Japanese ports to Mexican ports to fishing throughout the region. And the color coding, the red and the yellow, is relating to if they have missed a report in the last 3 days. P&A MSc was a world first, and we linked with a company called Sustainable for a venture called Pacifical. Pacifical is a traceability program that we developed so that retailers can track the origin of a batch of tuna. So for example, these are some of the labels used around the world. We're producing about 200 million units co-branded annually. about 150 product lines, 30 countries or regions globally, although I don't think we've got it selling in Korea. And we can provide traceability from the can code in the hands of the consumer back to the vessel. And this is all backed by blockchain. So this is quite an innovative system. It's like several of our world-leading systems, and it has been used as a very successful geographic indicator, putting P&A on the map. Part of the traceability behind it is outlined here. We have a concept of Msc eligibility, as opposed to the fish being MSC the moment it leaves the water. And because this was free school, we have very strict systems that maintain the integrity of the fish as being free school right through to the end, and the ability to track that data back through with video and other footage to the catching. MSC Pacifical is what I would term fish with a story. P&A received the first MSC certification for free school purse seine tuna in the world. It was always opposed by the big brands because they had an interest to see that it did not divide the market into sustainable and non-sustainable categories, which would complicate their marketing. The Pacifical JV was set up as a traceability platform and has been totally self-funded. The geographic indicator is run as a co-brand. This is a very subtle difference from being a brand, because as a co-brand, retailers pay us to associate with Pacifical and P&A, not us paying them to display our brand. It is backed by unrivaled at sea processor and retail chains of custody, including blockchain, which means that each can is traceable. We promote it in marketing, trade fairs, media, and other promotions. We also have taken on various interns to work in the management. This has all delivered on our leaders' visions for the goals of P&A office, which, if you recall, one of the parts of a cake was vertical integration and branding. The Pacifical GI has put P&A on the map. It's a bit like Fiji Water has put Fiji on the map. However, we have greater than 22 industry MSC certificates in the region in the purse seine and longline fishery, all free riding on P&A MSC certificate and P&A management regimes. None of them have the ability to impact management or validate their MSC certificates through third-party observer coverage. Industry returns for MSC are up in the short term, but competing MSC certificates are rapidly driving down the premiums as MSC has become a commodity. Ironically, it is MSC that is encouraging this and are now demanding the whole of fishery to be MSC, thus discarding MSC as an economic driver for the theory of change and giving a premium for better and more sustainable fishing. If we look at where it is, the P&A Pacifical is marketed throughout the world. About 73% of all MSC comes from the Western and Central Pacific, and of that, about 44.5% is from P&A of the global MSC. But it is rapidly losing its value as small certifications are competing with each other, and they are allowing the processors and the big brands to drive down the value. Who loses? Well, P&A and vertically integrated industry lose. Who wins? Well, the big brands, those who originally opposed the MSC certification. I'll come on to economic opportunities in the region. Here is a picture of purse seine transshipment in Majuro Lagoon, not a particularly sunny day. We see up to 40 purse seiners on any one day transshipping. I spoke earlier about the excess fee revenues. You can see how they progressively jumped under VDS, and also the share of fleets, FFA fleets. And what you see is almost 50% of the fleets are now, or about at least a third anyway, are now Pacific Island flag. So this is a growing situation, but that's not necessarily as positive as it sounds. The bigger picture with domestic or domestication, whether it is in fishing, processing, is that you'll see increased expenditure in country, taxes, revenues, but you also see some leakages. And then you should also see domestic benefits. This gives you what I term a multiplier effect. And in simple terms, it probably adds 2 to 3-fold the economic impact to an island economy by having a domestic industry. We have several processors, I think 6 in PNG and 1 in the Solomons and some in Fiji and 1 in Marshalls. And these are producing canned and cooked loins, frozen cooked loins, although the trend is towards loins, which can be processed in the region and canned in the industrialized world using existing plants and minimal labor. So it becomes product of Spain, which clearly is superior to a product of a Pacific island. But the potential for genuine domestic investors is quite large, but we need an internationally recognized competent authority for any long-term domestic participation. If you can't access the global markets, you are never going to see the full return. And the obvious area for market access is the European Union, which is one of the biggest markets and one of the more profitable markets. Subject to the above, the immediate prospects include domestication of fishing fleets. This gives jobs, foreign exchange, commerce, and supply in country. It also gives food security. Landing and grading and containerization in ports, this gives an opportunity for large-scale expansion of tuna exports. If it is landed in country and exported, it is an export. If it is transshipped in the lagoon, it is not. Industrial cold stores, they have a role for holding tuna for temperature conditioning, remembering that most tuna is brine frozen, so sometimes leaves the vessel at -12. It also allows export quality graded tuna to selected markets. It means if you want fish for katsuobushi, you get fish for katsuobushi. You don't have to find market for the rest of the catch that didn't meet the grade. If it was a public facility that was developed, it would also aid import and export sectors, and a common cold store could also service new and existing processors, as well as the whole economic community by way of supermarkets and other products. Service sector and stores are manifold, the opportunities. Net repairs, pad making, chandlery, marine electronics, hydraulics, electrical, welding, providoring, crew, transport, and the list goes on. But today, most of these services are coming in from Asia by carriers. Waste management is a growing area of opportunity. Plastics and other industrial wastes, waste oil, sewage, not just for the ships in the port, but also better handling of the sewage from towns. But there's also opportunity for bycatch. These are all opportunities in business. Value adding and small, medium enterprises, particularly in the areas of value adding bycatch, value adding processing waste, trimmings from processing lines for canned fish oil. These can address import replacement. They can produce niche export food products, food security, as well as fish and agricultural feeds. There is a lot of opportunity in this area, an opportunity to better utilize the fish to leave less waste. There's also opportunities for small and medium scale industrial processing, such as katsuobushi, jerky, cooked loins, frozen steaks, and micro canning. But a lot of help is going to be needed in financing, feasibility, technical support, and modeling. And just a few of the areas, dry docks, net yards, chandleries. But there is a reality check for our region. The interests of investors and the Pna의 nations really are aligned. Islandization of fleets, that is moving an old vessel to the islands to be flagged and replacing it with a brand new vessel, which happens in the industrialized fleets, means that the vessel moved to the island will often look for concessions and discounts to operate because it is typically inefficient. The highly efficient new replacement vessel stays with the parent company offshore. So now the foreign investor effectively has two vessels and perhaps 2.5 times the capacity to fish. This we are seeing quite commonly. And as I said, we've got 84 domestically flagged vessels in the region, and almost all of them would fit this model. The history of foreign investment in the Pacific can sadly be typically summed up as: one, they never show a profit or pay tax in country. And that is because all control, accounts, supplies are provided offshore by the parent company for a profit and for the shareholders' gain. They never seem to go bankrupt. It's interesting, the parent company is always willing to extend more loans to maintain the loss-making activity. And three, they never want to leave. It is obviously just too profitable losing money in the islands. This is not a criticism. It makes good business sense if you were the investor and if you can get away with it. But some investors in our region are rapidly outstaying their welcome because it's just gone on for too long. No one begrudges industry making profits, providing jobs, providing commerce, but not at the net cost to the flag states who are supporting it. And there's an example of new boats being built. And this year, we really don't know how many, but it's looking like it will be somewhere approaching 5 or 6. Lastly, I'll come on to food security, bycatch utilization, and micro canning. This is a project we started in Marshalls in 2015, and we've run throughout the region, dealing with small communities, largely utilizing transshipment rejects and bycatch, but also agricultural and other products. This is in Palau, with mackerel scat being canned and skipjack being canned. It's a small scale operation and appropriate to island economies. And the Jalali egg is actually a Marshallese label for a product produced in the Marshalls. Thank you very much. Kamasa hamnida.
네, 강현주님의 정성 어린 발표 감사드립니다.
Thank you for your presentation.
드디어 실시간으로 만나 뵙게 되어 줌이지만 굉장히 반갑습니다.
We'd like to express our gratitude, and it is great to meet you online.
현장에는 통역사 분님이 계시기 때문에 Q&A를 도와드릴 예정입니다.
We have an interpreter for you for the Q&A for your easy communication.
네, 지금부터 Q&A 시간을 가지겠습니다.
We will have the Q&A session from now on.
질문이 있으신 분들은 손을 들고 말씀을 해주시고, 온라인으로 접속하신 분들은 채팅창을 통해 말씀해 주시기 바랍니다.
Anyone who has questions, please raise your hand, and the participants who are online, please use the chat board for questions.
한국어로 질문을 하신다면 저희가 통역을 해드리겠습니다.
The participants who have questions in Korean, you can express your opinion in Korean. We will interpret it for you.
예, 발표 참 유익한 발표 잘 들었습니다. 제가 발표를 하시는 동안에 저희 통역하시는 분한테 제가 질문하고 싶은 아이템들을 미리 적어서 주었거든요. 그래서 그거를 좀 답변해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
So we've obtained the questions in advance, so we would like to ask those questions to the presenter.
지금 질문해 주세요.
So I will be asking the questions to the presenter. So the PNG, as we know, has the most VDS among the Pna members. The first question is, in your opinion, is the VDS enough for the nation? The second question is, how do you manage the left VDS? And the third question is, how do you manage it if you are short on the VDS? And the fourth on the VDS question is, could you share with us some of the flag states that enter to the PNG waters with VDS for the fishing activity?
네, 발표자님 연결되었는지 확인 부탁드립니다.
Mr. Brown John, are you with us? We can't hear you.
I am not mute. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Please proceed.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Sorry, my camera, I think, is not working, but the mute sorted out. Okay. Thank you. The first question is the Pna VDS, the Vessel Day Scheme, was introduced in 2008. It is the level of effort in our region is set by the Commission. And if we account the 1,000 days with Tokelau, which is a territory that works with the 8 Pna nations, it is 45,000 days. PNG's allocation varies subject to historic effort, but is nominally about 25%. It's enough most years, although the overall effort in the region very rarely gets up to the full 45,000 days. So there's always days left in reserve. If there are days left over, they are lost. The days are not transferable from year to year. If a country sees increased effort, such as currently when a lot of the fishing has moved to the west, then there is a mechanism where countries can trade days between each other. But the days remain property of the states, although the states will often assist industry in transferring from zone to zone. Does that sufficiently answer your question? Oh, sorry, the last question you had was flag state. All of the flag states fishing in Pna waters access PNG waters. That would be Korea, Japan, China, Taiwan, Philippines, US, Kiribati, Nauru, obviously PNG domestic, FSM, Tuvalu, Nauru, and Solomons. And the US, I think I mentioned earlier, the EU does not have access to our waters in the Pna countries currently. Thank you.
답변을 드리자면 Pna BDS, PNG는 현재 45,000 BDS를 가지고 있고 그것은 25% 정도이며 대부분 충분합니다. 그리고 그것이 이제 남는 것이 있으면 이월되거나 그런 것이 아니라 그냥 그 해에 소멸이 되고 혹시라도 그 기국이 남는 것이 있거나 부족한 것이 있으면 서로 트레이드가 가능합니다. 그래서 그 스테이트가 얻는 이익은 유지가 되고요. 네, 마지막 질문에 대한 답변은 모든 기국 Pna 수역에 어업을 하는 모든 기국이 EU를 제외하고는 어업을 하고 있습니다. And I will proceed with the next question. It is regarding the EMS, the electronic monitoring system. Many RFMOs have been discussing about implementing the EMS. And I'm wondering what PNG has its expression about this EMS. Is the PNG water enforcing the vessels that enter their waters to implement the EMS? And also, if not, how much coverage, which percentage of coverage do you enforce on the EMS? And also, we'd like to listen to the future plans for your states on regarding implementation of the EMS. Thank you.
So can I just clarify, EMS, you're talking electronic logs, or are you talking vessel monitoring system?
Vessel monitoring system.
Okay. VMS is mandatory for all vessels working in Pna waters. So I will answer on behalf of Pna as opposed to PNG, because PNG is one country within the 8 or 8+1, and all of the countries maintain the same policies. So I cannot talk specifically on PNG. I will talk on the Pna situation. Vessel registry is mandatory. That includes longliners, tankers, carriers, and purseaners. All of them, purseaners typically report every 1 hour, and during the FAD closure are required to report every 30 minutes. So it is a mandatory, it is a term of license, and there are, if the EMS, as you call it, fails, there are protocols on how to report or return to port. While I'm on it, we also have electronic logs, e-logs, and that is increasing. I think there's a very high percentage, and that is also mandatory. Thank you.
PNG는 Pna의 멤버이기 때문에 Pna의 그 규정에 따라야 하기 때문에 Pna에 대의 규정을 얘기하자면 모든 기국 선박은 BMS를 의무화하고 있고, 그리고 그것은 모든 선박, 연승, 탱커, 운반선, 선망선을 모두 포함을 하고 있고, 이것은 1시간마다 보고를 해야 하고 있습니다. 그리고 일렉트로닉 러그도 있기 때문에 이것을 활용하는 방안도 있습니다.
제가 말씀드린 것은 VMS가 아니고 특히 연성선에 선망선, 그거는 연성 선망 빼고 어선에 과학자료 수집이나 어획 활동의 감시를 위해서 일렉트로닉 모니터링 시스템을 들여오자고 논의 중인데요. 그 VMS가 아니고 과학자료 수집과 감시 옵서버를 대치하기 위해서, 또는 옵서버 커버리지를 높이기 위해서 EM 시스템을 도입하는 것으로 논의가 되어 있는데, 그 아까 박사님 말씀하신 것은 VMS를 말씀하셨는데, VMS하고 EM하고는 좀 다른 거여서, VMS에 대해서는 이미 우리 선사들도 다 알고 있고 이 분야 일하시는 분들이 이미 다 알고 있는데, 이제 지금 논의되고 있는 그 전자감시에 대해서 PNG 또는 Pna가 어떤 입장을 가지고 있는지 그걸 알고 싶습니다.
Thank you for your answers. Aside from the vessel monitoring system, VMS, we would like to hear more about the electronic monitoring system that is being started to be negotiated in the RFMOs that could replace the human observer in the vessels. Could you answer to that too? Thank you.
Sorry, what was the last question? Replace the human observer or place the human observer?
Replace the human observer by electronic monitoring.
All right. The Pna position on this is that human observers cannot be replaced by electronic monitoring, by cameras. I think both have a role, but we have found that both of them are not 100% accurate. They may be complementary. The position of the Pna has always been, so not always been, but it has in recent years been to maintain 100% observer coverage on purseine vessels, but the observer coverage on longliners is much, much lower, and the Commission sets a target of 5%, which I believe is not being reached. With COVID, we've had to suspend the mandatory 100% observer coverage, but we have still, for example, last year maintained about 40% coverage last year. This year will be a bit less, although we are proceeding to start looking at rolling out observers where possible, subject to them being fully vaccinated and COVID tested, and the vessels returning to the same ports. So although officially the observer program has been suspended, it has not been 100% stopped. It continues on some domestic vessels and some other vessels, and we are keen to re-establish the observer coverage because this is very useful, not just for compliance, but more significantly, it is useful for science to assist in the management of the fishery. I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Pna의 입장은 인간 옵저버를 100% 대체를 할 수 없기 때문에 휴먼 옵저버를 필요로 한다고 하는 입장이고요. EMS가 이것을 대체를 할 수 없다는 입장이고, 코비드 때문에 그 옵저버 커버리지가 줄어들긴 했지만 그 백신 접종률이라든지 테스트 완료된 그런 절차에 따라서 옵저버를 계속 생성을 시키고 있습니다. 그래서 옵저버가 중요한 요소로 작용을 하고 있다고 생각하고 있습니다.
예, 감사합니다.
Thank you. We also have some other questions. So you've mentioned that the brand Pacifical and MSC is competing in the Pna area. Could you clarify and explain more, compare more on the two brands?
Sorry, it's not that they compete. Pna was the first in the world to obtain an MSC certification for its free school purse seine fishery. So we were the first purse seine fishery to achieve this. But whilst the countries own the MSC certificate, they had no means of recovering the costs of operating it. So we entered into a venture with a Dutch company called Sustainable to develop a operation called Pacifical. Pacifical is basically a traceability platform, and it provides unrivaled traceability from the catch, from the boat right through the trip, the free school separation, and we continue the traceability right through to the processor and the processor outturn. So we can check, for example, whether there are FAD-related species in the catch, in which case it would be disqualified. This then feeds into a second chain of custody, which traces the CAN codes and the labels and the delivery documents right through to the supermarket. So we have the ability to take a CAN code in a consumer's hands, for example, in Japan, where we market the product, and you can go online and trace that can right back to the fishing vessel and the trip where it was caught. Such a system is still today unrivaled, and it is backed by blockchain technology. One of the changes that's happened in the fishery with MSC is, although Pna was the original MSC certificate holder, MSC has gone ahead and allowed numerous industry certificates. So today in the Pna waters, there are 22 certificates, both for longliners and for purse seiners. And to me, this is a very short-sighted initiative, because with everyone holding an MSC certificate, it means that the price and the value has been driven down. So it's not giving the same returns to industry that the premium on MSC originally gave them. So that's where we are today, is that MSC, although it's still the gold standard for sustainability, due to its very broad issuance to many players, they are actually competing with each other in the market, and thus, in my view, devaluing the economic value of the MSC certification. If there's further questions on this, I'm happy to answer.
파시피칼의 경우에는 추적 체계를 좀 더 확인을 하고 그것을 더 투명하게 추적을 할 수 있도록 도와주는 승인하는 그런 체계이며, 그래서 실제로 캔에 있는 코드를 확인해서 온라인으로 그것이 어떻게 어떤 절차를 통해서 이렇게 가공이 됐는지 확인을 할 수 있고 그러나 반면에 MSC 같은 경우에도 지속 가능성을 중요시하게 하고 있지만 더 나아가서 더 많은 기업들에게 기회를 주고 더 많은 기업들이 그 MSC 가치를 획득할 수 있게 했는데 그것이 오히려 사실은 프리미엄 가치를 좀 떨어뜨리고 MSC를 승인받은 기업들 간의 경쟁을 부추기는 것이라고 생각합니다. 더 추가 질문이 이에 대해서 추가 질문이 있으면 답변을 하겠습니다.
네, 저희가 사전에 받은 질문이 있어서 지금 진행을 하고 있는데요. 다음으로 추가 질문을 진행하겠습니다.
So moving on to the questions that we received in advance, some Korean longline industries have been maintaining or putting effort into achieving certificates for their sustainability. Could you give us some thoughts on that issue?
Okay. As I said, there are 22 certificates, long line and per seine. It is very good whilst MSC differentiates sustainable from less sustainable, or in other words, it gives a premium. So I think it makes a lot of sense for industry to look to an MSC certification if it is going to give them an economic advantage in the marketplace, so they can differentiate their stuff from everyone else's. But when everyone has a certificate, it becomes a commodity. And this will also happen in the per seine fishery when MSC achieve the whole of fishery as being MSC certified. So when this happens, your product with an MSC certificate is exactly the same as someone else's. So it does not give you any economic advantage. It's a tick to say the fishery is sustainable, but it doesn't give your company any advantage once everyone has the MSC. There is a couple other issues there. I just sort of lost my track a little bit, but let's stop at that point.
Okay. 그 MSC를 획득하는 것은 좋지만 그리고 그 경제 시장에서 프리미엄을 획득할 수 있으면 프리미엄을 획득해서 경제 가치가 있으면 좋지만 그 모든 경쟁사들이 MSC를 갖고 있다면 그 MSC를 획득한 그 기업 간에 경쟁을 해야 하기 때문에 똑같은 그 프리미엄이 적을 것이다라고 생각합니다.
Sorry, if I could just add on top of that, the other point I was going to raise was that when industry holds an MSC certificate as opposed to the regional governments holding it, one of the pillars of the 3 pillars of MSC is management. An industry held certificate, industry has no means of influencing the governance of the fishery, the sustainability, the regional management, the RFMO. Those are actually at governmental level. So it's unclear how the MSC can be awarding so many MSC certificates to industry groups that are totally reliant upon the RFMO and the regional management bodies like Pna의 to maintain the sustainability of the fishery and to justify their certification. This is a problem with MSC, is that they don't necessarily go as far defending their brand and defending their principles as I personally think they should.
MSC 같은 경우에는 그 기준 중 하나가 관리와 거버넌스를 확인하는 그런 규정이 있는데 이것은 기업이 할 수 있는 것이 아니라 RFMO와 정부 그 기준에서 바꿀 수 있고 변화시킬 수 있는 거기 때문에 기업이 어떻게 하는 것에 한계가 있다고 생각합니다. 그렇기 때문에 MSC가 어떻게 이 관리와 거버넌스를 기준으로 MSC 인증을 줄 수 있는지 의문점을 가지고 있습니다.
네, 시간 관계상 이것으로 첫 번째 Q&A
하나만 더 할게.
아, 네.
하나. 예. 마지막으로 간단한 거 하나만 더 여쭤보겠습니다. MSC에서 최근 발표한 내용을 보면 WCPFC 수역에서 MSC를 받은 MSC 유닛이 있는데 그 WCPFC가 2022년까지 아마 제 기억으로 2022년까지 하베스트 컨트롤 룰을 채택하지 않으면은 그 MSC 취더 서티피케이션을 서스펜드 하겠다는 보도를 보았습니다. 이와 관련해서 Pna는 어떤 노력을 하고 있는지 할 계획인지 좀 말씀해 주세요.
Recently, MSC announced that if the WCPFC does not obtain the harvest control rule by 2022, MSC will suspend the certification of the companies that are related. What are the thoughts on Pna and what are their future plans in obtaining this HCR, harvest control rule?
Okay, thank you. That's a very good question. So if you look at my presentation, there was what's termed the Green Tower, which is the sustainability status of the tropical fisheries. You see the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic, and the EPO are in problems with sustainability. Those fisheries, some of those, actually have harvest controls and harvest strategies in place, so they meet the MSC standard. But I think what MSC is missing is it is not the piece of paper that brings sustainability. It is actually the management. So the Pna fishery, which in the case of skipjack generates 50% of the world catch, at least up to 70% of the world catch of skipjack, is green and it is harvested at about 40% of the unfished biomass, whereas in other oceans it's down perhaps 20% or less left in the water. So as we have the healthiest fishery in the world and we don't have the harvest strategies and things in place according to MSC, on what basis should they suspend us and keep other fisheries where they do have harvest strategies, but their fisheries are seriously overfished and in decline, being deemed as meeting the standard? So to me, something is very wrong with MSC's messaging. So on one side, we're happy to wait and see what they do. If we were to develop a harvest strategy and harvest control rules at the Commission level, we've been at it for many years, but some industrialized nations appear to be dragging their heels or delaying the process. That is out of our control. In Pna, it is argued we could introduce our own, but one of the questions is, if we were to establish a harvest strategy in Pna waters, we would have to take responsibility for the fishing activity in non-Pna waters. So, for example, Southeast Asia. And the reports that are coming into the Commission is the effort is totally unmanaged in Southeast Asia, and they are not meeting some of the requirements. So it seems unreasonable for Pna to be taking responsibility for other areas of the RFMO, but it's encouraging that overall we are maintaining the healthiest fishery in the world. And this is actually, in my view, the result of VDS. And one of the factors of VDS, although MSC since 2015 in their Hong Kong adjudication have ruled that we do not meet the standard, prior to that, they did accept we meet the standard. Because VDS is an effort control, and it is an effort that is pegged to match the harvest that we require to maintain sustainability. So if the fishery is in decline, we cut the effort. That is actually the same as a harvest control rule, but it is not called a harvest control rule. So my suggestion to your industry is let's wait and see what MSC do. Are they really going to close the biggest purse seine fishery and the biggest longline fishery in the world, which is the Western and Central Pacific, just because we haven't got a paper or a management regime with the right title? Or are they going to recognize the good governance we have in the region and maintain the certificate? This is up to MSC, and we just wait and see what they decide. At the end of the day, it makes no difference to the sustainability or the value of our fishery. Thank you.
Pna의 경우는 전 세계적으로 가다랑어 어획의 50에서 70%를 담당을 하고 있는데, 그럼에도 불구하고 아까 발표에서도 봤듯이 어획 자원량이 몹시 양호한 상태이며 그 자원량도 40% 이상 유지되는 잘 관리가 되고 있다고 생각을 하고 있지만, MSC가 그 HCR이 없다는 이유로 그 MSC를 잠정적으로 중단한다고 발표를 했습니다. 근데 이것은 그 MSC 기준에 HCR이 없지만 사실 아까도 봤듯이 자원량 관리는 잘 되어 있기 때문에 어떻게 MSC가 이 MSC를 어떻게 중지를 할지, 이 기업을 어떻게 할지 우리는 아직 잘 모릅니다. 그리고 이제 위원회에서 HCR을 정하는 것은 사실 위원회와 정부 레벨에서 해야 되는 것이기 때문에 Pna가 적극적으로 할 수 있는 것은 없고, 그거 우리가 Pna가 HCR을 발표를 한다고 해도 이것은 우리 수역 외에도 다른 수역에서도 책임을 져야 되기 때문에 사실 Pna가 적극적으로 할 수 있는 것은 어렵습니다. 그리고 아까도 말했듯이 우리 Pna 수역에서 어획량을 이렇게 자원량을 잘 효과적으로 관리를 할 수 있는 것은 BDS의 효과라고 생각하고, 이것이 MSC가 제시하는 기준과는 맞진 않다고 해도 이것은 하나의 어획 규제의 방법이기 때문에 Pna는 우리가 잘 관리를 하고 있다고 생각하고, MSC가 앞으로 어떻게 반응을 할지에 대해서는 기다려보자고 하는 입장입니다.
예, 귀중한 답변 감사합니다.
Thank you for your answers.
예, 시간이 제약이 있어서 여러 가지 질문 여기 참석자분들이 많을 것 같은데요. 그것은 나중에 혹시 오늘 이 인연을 계기로 추가 질문에 대해서 답변해 주실 수 있다면 더 감사하겠습니다.
Due to time constraints, we will stop here. If there's more questions, we would like to contact by email or by email.
No, that's fine. I'm happy to answer any questions. You can send them through at any time. Thank you.
예, 감사합니다.
네, 이상으로
Thank you.
네, 발표자님 다시 한번 감사드립니다. 이상으로 첫 번째 Q&A 세션을 종료하겠습니다.